Welcome to our 8th video in our module on communion, Food for the Journey, Chapter 7, Holy Communion and Methodism. Around 1733, John Wesley wrote a sermon entitled The Duty of Constant Communion. In it, he urged regular reception, weekly or even daily, and dismantled a list of arguments against such a practice. In 1788, 3 years before his death, Wesley reissued the sermon with a brief note that he had shortened it a bit because I then used more words than I do now, but he also added, I thank God I have not yet seen cause to alter my sentiments in any point in that sermon. The sermon was a source of embarrassment to many 19th century Methodists who preferred religion in which the sacraments played only a small and significant role. Wesley's constant attendance at communion strikes us as barely short of obsessive. Wherever possible, he attended a service with communion on Sundays and even on weekdays. He noted in his journal on a page marked communion these following dates: November 27th and December 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th of 1738. January 1st, 6th, 13th, 15th, 16th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 31st, and February 2nd, 5th, 8th, 12th, 14th, 19th, 21st, and 23rd of 1739. In this 3-month period, he communicated 38 times. Communicated is the term used when one is receiving communion. Sometimes he served communion in an Anglican church or to a sick person, but in most cases, even as a clergy person himself, the overwhelming number of instances were when he attended a church as a member of that congregation. Wesley urged reception of his followers. In most cases, the Methodists were indeed devoted to the sacrament to an extent that caused one recent historian to note this. It is not uncommonly known today, either by Anglicans or by Methodists, that the Wesleyan revival was as much a Eucharistic revival as an evangelical revival. This Wesleyan revival included a warm and joyous interpretation of the meaning of the sacrament, as evidenced in the 1745 collection of hymns by the Wesley brothers, largely Charles, which included 166 songs about communion. In 1745, what were Methodists supposed to do with 166 Eucharistic hymns? The answer? Methodists were to use these hymns at home for personal preparation prior to receiving communion and for follow-up meditation after reception. Likely, they also sung them within their small groups called bands. These 166 texts at first were primarily for prayer and study, and apparently they were used well. In 1745, this 1745 hymnal went through 11 printings. Unfortunately, most of these hymns on communion are utterly unfamiliar to us, but a few of them remain in our current United Methodist hymnal. Wesleyan theology of the Eucharist and some hymn lyrics. The 4 hymns that we are going to look at today are found in the United Methodist hymnal page or number 613, 616, 635, 627. Here's our first one. O thou, this mysterious bread. United Methodist hymnal 613. The tune goes like this. Here are the words. O God, who this mysterious bread did in Emmaus break, return for now our souls to feed, and to your followers speak. Unseal the volume of your grace, apply the gospel word. Open our eyes to see your face, our hearts to know the Lord. With you communing still, we stay till you the veil remove. Talk with us, and our hearts shall burn with flames of fervent love. Enkindle now the heavenly zeal, and make your mercy known, and give our pardoned souls to feel that God and love are one. It's not a perfect rhyme, but that gives us a sense of perhaps maybe how they pronounced words several centuries ago in English. Note how the Eucharist here is a continuation of the Emmaus meal, not merely as a repetition of what occurred in the upper room prior to the crucifixion. This is often lost in the church to say, open our hearts to know the Lord, based on Luke 24:35. Thus, Holy Communion is a continuing way in which Christians recognize the presence of the risen Christ in their midst. This reflects the Wesley's Anglican insistence that the sacrament is an effective means of grace in the present, not simply a mental recall on past events. Our next one is Come Sinners to the Gospel Feast on number 616. 616. And here are the words to that. Come, sinners, to the gospel feast. Let every soul be Jesus' guest. You need not now be left behind, for God has called all humankind. Do not begin to make excuse. Do not let his grace refuse. Your worldly fears and pleasures leave, and take what God has to give. See him set before your eyes. Behold the bleeding sacrifice. His offered love be quick to embrace, and freely now be saved by grace. You who believe his record's true shall dine with him and he with you. Come to the feast, be saved from sin, for Jesus waits to take you in. Here, believers are urged to set aside all usual excuses, particularly the one that I, a sinner, am not worthy to receive, and to take what Jesus gives, his sacramental flesh and blood. In the bread and cup, the Lord offers grace that is not to be refused. Holy Communion sets before us again and again the sacrifice of the cross. Now, because thou hast said, from 6:35. 6:35. Because thou hast said. Let's read these words. Because you have said, do this for my sake, the mystical bread we gladly partake. We thirst for the Spirit that flows from above and long to inherit your fullness of love. It's here we look up and grasp at your mind. It's here that we hope your image to find. The means of bestowing your gifts we embrace, but all things are indebted to Jesus' grace. In this poem, the Eucharist is clearly a means of grace and a gift of the Spirit through which we find the fullness of divine love. Thus, we hope to have within ourselves the mind of Christ, the image of God. The Eucharist is the means of bestowing your gifts we embrace, and the utter dependence of the means of grace on the saving work of Christ. But all things are indebted to Jesus' grace. Thus, Wesley is balancing two very important ideas. Holy Communion is neither simply a memorial of past events just to help us remember, and neither is it a mechanical deposit of grace completely detached from Christ's redemptive work and devoid of any personal faith. For our last one, we have Oh, the Depth of Love Divine from the United Methodist Hymnal 627. Oh, the depth of love divine. Oh, the depth of love divine, the unfathomable grace. Who can say how the bread and wine God into us convey? Or how the bread his flesh imparts, or how the blood transmits his blood. It fills his faithful people's hearts with all the life of God. Let the wisest humans show how we the grace receive, feeble elements bestow a power not theirs to give. Who can explain the wondrous way, how though these the virtues came, there the virtue does convey, yet still remain the same? How can spirits to heaven rise from earthly matter fed, or drink to gain divine supplies and eat immortal bread? Ask the Father's wisdom how, Christ who did the means ordain. Angels round our tables bow to search it out in vain. Sure and real is the grace, the manner be unknown. Only meet us in your ways and perfect us into one. Let us taste the heavenly powers, Lord. We ask for nothing more. Yours to bless, 'tis only ours to wonder and adore. This is the most complex of Wesley's Eucharistic texts. Here, Wesley explains that not even the wisest person on earth can explain how bread and wine can be more than just bread and wine. They are feeble elements that appear to give nothing more than full stomachs. But bread and wine do convey a power they do not have inherently themselves. The presence of Christ in the bread and cup is made possible by the power of the Spirit. In the third verse, the notion that Christ somehow comes down to the table in the sacrament, common to many traditions, is replaced with the suggestion that at the Eucharist, we are taken upward to join the heavenly Christ. It is a mystery, says Wesley, how our spirits can rise to heaven while bound to earth. How our spirits can rise to earth while bound to earth we are as we eat and drink what is divine and immortal. The Father's wisdom is Jesus Christ himself. If you would like to know how, says Wesley, then ask Jesus Christ himself. He is the one who ordained this to us by saying, "Do this." Yet, humorously, you can ask Christ all you want how all this can be possible, but you will not understand if you are told. For the very angels of heaven hover above our communion tables in stunned reverence, unable to grasp the great mystery ourselves. Wesley is telling us this is something to be experienced rather than to be understood. Yes, Holy Communion is a reliable means of God's grace, but the manner in which this happens remains unknown. It is a divinely chosen way through which communion between God and God's church is created. Thus, we are commanded to observe it. We are asked to taste and see, not to understand them. God's gift is to bless us. Our response is not to ask questions, but to bow in wonder and adoration. Perhaps, just perhaps, when we do, our minds will be opened. This may well be the finest hymn in the Eucharist anywhere in the English language. Methodist practice. The first is open communion. Methodists boast proudly of having an open communion table. This does not mean we do not care at all who partakes, but it does mean that we welcome people of all denominations and do not exclude those who have been baptized but not yet confirmed. Indeed, children have usually been welcomed at Methodist tables as soon as they could grasp the elements. But sometimes this understanding of open communion is misunderstood, making this sacred meal indistinguishable from coffee hour. Holy Communion is for the baptized is still true even in United Methodist churches, although we don't mean to say for the baptized only. Instead, it would be better stated as Holy Communion is first for the baptized. The not yet baptized are welcomed too. Wesley understood the Eucharist as a converting ordinance that allows lives to be changed and could produce in us a confident profession of faith. Those not yet baptized could be led to make a decision through the sacrament of food toward the sacrament of water. While the baptism first, communion second has been and still remains the normal way, Wesley understood that it didn't have to be the only way. So hear these words of Jeffrey Wainwright. No one should be refused communion who seeks after the saving fellowship with the Lord through the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. But then he or she should be brought to baptism, and soon. For this person has been drawn to the Lord's table. He or she, by the very receiving of the elements, has been constituted a witness to the saving work of God. But if this person refuses baptism, he or she is not earnest about entering the kingdom, and this person should not be admitted to the Lord's table again until he or she has been so persuaded. While Methodists do not practice barring or excommunication from the Lord's table, our current policy as United Methodists compels the clergy and lay leadership to ask those who are unbaptized but receive communion about their intentions to be baptized. It is likely that they suffer from an insignificant misunderstanding about the meaning of one or both of the sacraments, a fault that lies within the Church's responsibility to educate and equip. This dialogue with communicants should always remain active. This holy mystery, the United Methodist Church's officially approved document on Holy Communion, states this: the baptized present are all invited, even if they belong to a different church. Those not baptized are not barred from receiving, but should be counseled and nurtured toward baptism as soon as possible. The term open communion, thus, is a term used by denominations that mutually recognize the baptisms of other Christian traditions. Hence, if we recognize the validity of baptisms in other Christian traditions, we are affirming the unity of the Church and can extend our table appropriately. The United Methodist Church acknowledges the validity of the baptisms of all formally recognized Christian traditions and denominations, whether or not they maintain formal membership status. monthly or quarterly communion. The infrequent occurrence of Holy Communion in Methodist churches is a remnant of Wesley's insistence that only the ordained may administer the sacrament. In early American Methodism, most preachers were laity, specially licensed but not ordained to ministry. The fully ordained, while few in numbers, were put on rotating circuits over wide geographical areas and were directed to visit each location 4 times a year at least. These ministers were called presiding elders, now known as district superintendents, and conducting the business of the congregation in sessions called quarterly conferences. They also administered baptisms and the Lord's Suppers at these visits. Many congregations continue quarterly communion long after they had ordained clergy appointed to them, specifically as pastors. This is despite the fact that in his 1784 instructions to the American Church, Wesley advised the ordained elders to administer the supper of the Lord on every Lord's Day, every Sunday. Many United Methodist churches, as well as many churches in other denominations, are seeing the truth and benefit behind weekly communion. Wine versus juice. Wesley did not object to the use of wine either for personal or sacramental use. He did, however, distinguish between wine and distilled spirits. The latter were to be avoided, as was all drunkenness. Methodist prohibitions against sacramental wine are rooted in later abstinence movements in the early 20th century. Today, the use of grape juice, which could not have been invented until pasteurization was perfected, allows recovering alcoholics to partake of the sacrament without fear or relapse, as well as the participation of children and youth. The term wine is retained in our liturgy because of its biblical and historical significance. Clergy preside, but no pre-consecration. In the United Methodist Church, only ordained or licensed pastors are authorized to consecrate the elements and preside at the celebration of communion. But lay people can assist the pastor. The pastor's role is essential to a proper understanding of breaking bread together. Indeed, in the United Methodist Church, members may not celebrate the Lord's Supper without the presence of a properly credentialed pastor. Pastors also should not observe the Lord's Supper without the presence of a congregation, even if that congregation is only 1 or 2 other people. A pastor should not simply go into his or her study and attempt to consecrate a stack of elements to send along on a youth trip, or worse, to send to a church without a pastor. The pastor should not attempt to consecrate elements that will be frozen for later use. So why maintain such a tradition? Is it merely a way to preserve clerical power? Why not let anybody preside at the Lord's table whenever and wherever the Spirit moves them? In response to these questions, I remind you about the self-centered meal practices in ancient Corinth. As you will recall, some were going ahead with a lavish meal even to the point of drunkenness, while others were sneaking in at the last minute and receiving very little, if anything. That came from 1 Corinthians 11, 21 through 22. Paul bid them to correct their problem by following this simple rule. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. That was 1 Corinthians 11:33. The rule requiring the pastor or designated leader to preside at the Lord's table is an ancient discipline with a wise end in mind. It requires the church to wait for one another. That is, it requires the church to gather for Eucharist. Many spiritual disciplines retain their integrity when practiced by individuals and by independently organized small groups, but not the Eucharist. By its very nature, the Lord's Supper must be a communal experience. Celebration of the Eucharist requires a pastor and a congregation. Therefore, we do not pre-consecrate the elements for use elsewhere or at a different time. This means that a pastor prays over the bread and juice beforehand, so that they do not have to pray over it during. They do not have to be prayed over during the service. This is common in places where 1. Churches don't have a pastor who is authorized to consecrate the elements. That is usually called a lay minister. 2, there is convenience of time. 3, lay people take the bread to shut-ins. In fact, pre-consecration fails to understand how the bread and wine are blessed. God's grace is made available through the sacrament as we thank God together in a congregational setting. Taking communion to shut-ins immediately after a communion service is an extension of the table and is acceptable and even encouraged. But if you see or hear of a pastor doing this, you now know that this is not appropriate, although sometimes a very common practice, and one should discourage such actions. To be very clear, the insistence that an ordained or licensed clergy person should be the one presiding over the ritual does not mean that they have any special powers or divine gifts over the people in the pews. The authority comes from the fact that the church, in the form of the annual conference and indirectly by the local congregation, has elected them to be leaders and to represent the unity of the church universal. Receiving the bread. Should the people take a piece or receive a piece from the pastor? It is theologically more appropriate for the people to receive a piece of bread from the person serving, whether it's a lay person or clergy. To take a piece by tearing it off yourself says this: I can obtain salvation myself. Receiving with open palms means this: I can do nothing but receive the goodness of God. I will respond by eating it. This is a very subtle but important distinction. I'd say the most important distinction of ever. Having only one person touch the bread, after having their hands sanitized, minimizes the spreading of germs as well. The Center for Disease Control issued a statement several years ago that indicated that intinction, the dipping pieces of bread in a single cup, is the most hygienic way to serve communion as long as one person tears off each piece of bread, that this person washes their hand thoroughly immediately beforehand, and the pieces are big enough for the individual to dip the bread without touching the cup or the juice with their fingers. Alternately, the person handling the bread and cup and dip the pieces in the bread themselves before the congregant receives the elements. Online communion. This is a strange one, but a symbol of our modern times. Many churches broadcast their services on a local TV channel. And of course, this was all written before the coronavirus pandemic in 2020. And so this has been something to consider even more so now, as many churches are putting their services on Facebook Live or YouTube or Zoom. In most cases, people at home watch the people in the church receive communion. In some churches, shut-ins are encouraged to take a piece of bread and some juice from the refrigerator, place them up to the screen during the Great Thanksgiving, and have their elements blessed through the screen. Such questions have been raised. Can God bless through a TV screen? Does it work if the broadcast is not live? Well, such questions are irrelevant. Technology is not a hindrance for God, but online communion eliminates the communal experience. It lets the church off the hook from doing the more preferred way of extending the table, in which members of the church go to the shut-ins places of residence. In times of global pandemic in which social distancing, sheltering in place, and lockdowns are issued by the church and state, online communion may be very tempting. Such was the case during the 2020 coronavirus outbreak. Special consideration to host online communion should be made based on the length of time these restrictions are in place. Such a determination will be arbitrary, but should be made in conversation with other clergy members. The real unilateral presence of Christ. This holy mystery states the Christian church has struggled through the centuries to understand just how Christ is present in the Eucharist. Arguments and divisions have occurred over the matter. The Wesleyan tradition affirms the reality of Christ's presence, although it does not claim to be able to explain it fully. Our tradition asserts the real, personal, living presence of Jesus Christ. For United Methodists, the Lord's Supper is anchored in the life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, but is not primarily a remembrance or memorial. We do not embrace the medieval doctrine of transubstantiation that is held by Roman Catholics, that the bread and wine literally turn into the body and blood of our Savior. Though we do believe that the elements are essential, tangible means through which God works. We understand the divine presence in temporal and relational terms. In the holy meal of the church, the past, present, and future of the living Christ come together by the power of the Holy Spirit, so that we may receive and embody Jesus Christ as God's saving gift for the world.